So, Tim, we woke up this morning to a statement from President Donald J. Trump in which he said, "I am pleased to announce that the great Elon Musk, working in conjunction with American patriot Vivek Ramaswamy, will lead the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Together, these two wonderful Americans will pave the way for my administration to dismantle government bureaucracy, slash excess regulations, cut wasteful expenditures, and restructure federal agencies. It's essential," he says, Tim, "to the Save America movement. This will send shockwaves through the system and anyone involved in government waste, which is a lot of people," apparently was Elon Musk's response. I actually saw that on Elon Musk's Twitter feed, and it's already got 50 million views.
Well, Trump is calling it the Manhattan Project of our time. That's the project famous for blowing everything up. But one thing that you've got to understand about this statement is the colourful use of capital letters. So the great Elon Musk, great itself is capitalized, and the American patriot Vivek Ramaswamy. American patriot is capitalized. That's one thing I love about him is he writes as if he was shouting.
Let's hear. So remember, Tim, it's a few weeks ago, wasn't it, before the American election, the two of us discussed that slightly odd but fascinating interview between Donald Trump and Elon Musk on X. It was live streamed. And Elon Musk mentions Javier Milei, the leader of Argentina. And today I've seen on my social feeds, there's a very funny video of Milei looking at a government org chart and just ripping off whole departments. Environment, gone. Education, gone. Health, gone. And this idea, we were chatting, weren't we? It is an idea mostly associated with the right, but there is also an agenda within what might be described as the Blairite left, which has been very, very similar, and maybe the Clintonite Democrats, where there is a belief that governments could save a huge amount of money, which could be put into services or returned to people in tax cuts, if only they could grapple the monster that is federal government in the US or the UK government here. If they could grapple that to the ground. Let's just hear a little bit of Elon Musk and Donald Trump from that live stream when they are discussing Milei and the size of the state.
I think we have the worst inflation we've had in 100 years. They say it's 48 years. I don't believe it. I think we have the worst. They don't include a lot of the items that should be included. You know.
Yeah. Well, it's just from government overspending and not spending taxpayer money effectively, and having just like so many departments you can't even name them all. And what Milei is doing is he's cutting government spending. He's simplifying things. He's putting in regulations that make sense. And Argentina overnight is experiencing a giant improvement in prosperity. But it's also a lesson for the United States, which is that Argentina used to be one of the most prosperous countries in the world. In the 30s, 40s, and because of bad government policy, it ruined the country. And if you take Venezuela, for example, Venezuela should be incredibly prosperous. They have phenomenal reserves of everything, oil, everything, and it should be prosperous. But if the government's wrong, it impoverishes the people. And so I think we should not be complacent in the United States in thinking that and taking our prosperity for granted, because if with bad government policy, we can run the country into the ground.
Well, just to say, what's interesting there is how Argentina has become the laboratory for conservative economics. And just to pick up on some of those claims, they're right. Milei has shut departments. He has sacked people. He has cut spending. And they're also correct that inflation has radically fallen, that their reserves of currency have gone up, and that in market terms they're performing much better. But what's also gone up is the poverty rate, because those programs were supporting people.
This is the big issue, isn't it? That the right and some parts of the left, they want to cut programs but these programs are often supporting the people who have struggled under capitalist systems. I mean, there are always winners and losers to an extent. And if we look back, Donald Trump made many similar claims before his 2016 victory. Cutting the state was a big part of his offer to voters then, and of course, he won. But once in government, the whole equation starts changing. So during Trump's first presidency between 2016 and 2020, the size of the federal government actually grew. So at around about 0.9% a year. Now, that doesn't sound very much, but when you're talking close on 2 million direct federal employees, it's quite a large number. If you compare that with the second Barack Obama term, that grew by 0.3%. So the intention might be to do one thing, but when that comes to cutting programs for your voters, state by state or at the federal level, cutting education programs, we often see waste as there's a scheme where they're promoting yoga for sharks. There's a scheme where guinea pig farms are stopping federal highways being built. They all may well be true, but the amounts involved in each of those are tiny. Whereas when you look at the social security budget or education support for poorer counties in America, these are huge multi-billion-pound projects, and cutting them is incredibly politically different. So the will is always there, the desire, the easy, frankly, X tweets. What will be fascinating, Elon Musk cut X's workforce from 8,000 to 1,800. He fired also a lot of his critics within X as well. So he used it not just for bottom line purposes, but also for political purposes. So it'll be interesting to see which bits of the state he thinks in America should be cut. But there is a brutality to the way he has approached running private businesses. But you simply can't transfer that into public works, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that you can.
Also, the things that conservatives want to do very often cost money. So if, for instance, you want to begin your term by deporting millions of people, you're going to have to hire the agents to do that. If you want to expand what is basically an NHS in America for veterans, you're going to have to spend more money in order to do that. So there are going to be some areas of natural growth in the Trump administration as well. But I take that point. I mean, I think the starting point for modern conservatives in America isn't actually the Reagan era, it's the 1920s. That's what you have to compare everything to the era when Republicans were in favor of closed borders, protectionism, and getting out of international affairs. And the dominant figure economically in that period was Andrew Mellon, who was the US Secretary of the Treasury. And what did Mellon do? He did what Milei is doing in Argentina. He cut taxes dramatically, he cut spending dramatically. And the theory is that drove over a decade of wild growth. Now, of course, that also ended in the Wall Street crash. So there's a lot of critics of that approach as well. But there is running across the right this fundamental belief that the basic problem is government is too big, and that if you cut it, that will free up so much wealth and capacity for the private sector, along with deregulation, that growth will take the place of whatever government was doing to help keep people out of poverty.
It will be interesting to see what the results of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy's work is. They are not government employees. A joke has been made that an efficiency unit that needs to be run by two people is not very efficient. They won't be government employees. Now, that might be seen as a good thing, i.e. they don't get wrapped up in the government processes. But also, of course, it's very useful for Elon Musk because not being an official government employee means that he doesn't have to divest himself of his business interests, which are gargantuan, and many of which are very reliant on government contracts. I'm assuming he won't be cutting those. If you look at the broader government-funded workforce. So there's the federal workforce, which is the direct people that work for the federal government. And then the government-funded workforce, which is over 10 million people. So that's a lot of jobs. That includes the military, and Donald Trump, in his first term, increased military spending dramatically, whether he will want to do that again. The postal services, all contractors, grants employees. One of the biggest areas of growth during Biden's presidency for federally funded employees was the new veterans healthcare system, veterans hospitals. Veterans are a very powerful group, rightly, in America. Their services were always pretty poor. Trump and Biden lent into supporting veterans. Very expensive, and a lot of people. The argument, I think, from people like Keir Starmer and Kamala Harris in America, Keir Starmer here, is, okay, we kind of get the point, the argument, release wealth creation, stop government waste, but which bits are you going to cut, and how are you going to actually do that?
Yeah. I think stepping back from it, there are two key things about this appointment. One is it signals that Trump's appointments across the board, and we've seen this with the rest of the cabinet, are going to be people who agree with Trump's philosophy and will do what Trump wants to do. Because Trump is haunted by the experience of the first term, in which he could rely on his family to do a lot of work, but he also had to rely on a lot of Republican office holders who didn't actually share his ideology and didn't actually do what he wanted. And in many cases, they resigned or he had to sack them. So this time around, he's not going to make that mistake again. He's going to hire people who agree with him. And what do they agree with him about? Well, they use this phrase, the administrative state. The administrative state. That's what they want to roll back. They believe that since the end of the Second World War, the state has grown, not just in welfare, but warfare and in management of the economy. And that state, which is governed by a bureaucracy of woke liberals, usually college educated, right? It runs America now, and it makes it impossible to do anything. So Elon likes to give the example of the high-speed rail project in California, where $7 billion was spent in order to build a 1,600-foot section of it, which doesn't even have rail. This reminds one of the failure of HS2 in this country, and of course we're talking about the £100 million bat shed over here. There is this sense in America as well that government has got so big that it now gets in the way of government, because whenever you try and do anything, you come up against some kind of value for money thing, or you come up with some sort of regulation or some extra costs, some bureaucrats you have to deal with, to the point whereby you can't do anything anymore. So deconstruct the administrative state, and in Elon's mind, replace it with something called effective altruism. And effective altruism means you don't do nothing. The government doesn't do nothing. It just tries to work out in the long term what's actually going to make a difference to people's lives, and you put all your resources into that. So in Elon's mind, the long-term future is tech, AI, etc. So let's strip away the bits of government which get in the way. Let's redirect resources towards things like improving infrastructure, which are going to have, in the long run, an effective altruistic outcome for people. So so what Trump is trying to do, in sum, is appoint people who will both deconstruct the government and then remake it in their own image.
Whether or not that's achievable, we will see, I think, over the next 4 years. And I think everyone's got to be excited by the idea of trying something new, because where we have got to is not satisfactory to voters. They've made that very clear. They're constantly kicking out incumbents. The experience of Argentina, I think, is a good one to look at. Here, this morning, I saw Liz Truss has tweeted the Donald Trump statement on the Department of Government Efficiency. She said, what she said with the tweet is, "What is needed in Britain," is what she said. But I'm always reminded that Liz Truss, who came in with a similar type of agenda, we need to cut back the state, what she called the blob, she still thought that it was necessary for the government to pay people's energy bills.
Of course.
Because it's very, very difficult to do things that the public don't like and to hang on to popularity, because in the end, politics is a popularity contest. I was also reminded with the Liz Truss tweet that on this side of the Atlantic, we have done often many, many similar things. Philip Green, the retailer, now, of course, very controversial, but he was the head of British Home Stores and many a Topshop and many other retail businesses. He was asked in 2010, I think it must have been by David Cameron as the new Conservative Prime Minister, to look at government efficiency. And he brought out the report, which was rather unfairly fashioned as they should buy biros more efficiently.
Yeah.
But the point he was making, that even in procurement, the fact that each government department had separate ways of buying, for example, their energy to keep the lights on, their stationery, including biros, whatever it might have been, they all operated completely differently. And he said if there was a central purchasing function, sounds dull, but actually would save, he claimed, many tens or maybe even hundreds of millions of pounds. He also said that the government was terrible at data and linking things up. This is a Dominic Cummings argument, isn't it? Regularly, the appalling
NHS
nature.
used to be the world's leading purchaser of fax machines, didn't it?
And it still, I think, it has paper records for a lot of
Right.
for a lot of patients and a lot of the work they do. So you can tell rightly why there is frustration. But for people like Elon Musk, I think he will crash into the subject and say, why can't I behave in the way I behaved at X?
Yes.
Well, you can't, because it's not a private business. You cannot get rid of people in the same way. And what Musk will need to do, who's never run a government department or never been in direct politics, is how do I do this, but with an eye to the fact that if everyone goes on strike and everything is closed down, one of the things, isn't it, that sounds so sort of aggressive, popular, controversial is, in America, get rid of the Department of Education.
Yeah.
The Federal Department of Education. This has been a Republican dream, I think, or a Republican project since 1979. Sounds really dramatic.
Yeah.
But of course, 90% of education in America is run by the states and local wards beneath state level. So it leaves you 10% actually run or supported by federal government. Second thing is, the Department of Education at a federal level employs just over 4,000 people out of a total federal workforce of nearly 2 million. So it's actually very, very small. And what are you going to do about the two things? And this goes back to Argentina. They do a huge amount of federal support for poorer schools. They do a huge amount of federal support for supporting children, for supporting disabled children. And they also run the $1.6 trillion student loan system. And so there's always this concern that business people think, yeah, but you just need to be kind of do this and do this. And actually, you get into it, and public works are just completely different.
I take your point. I think in the case of, for example, education, the debate is not just about material savings. The debate is also philosophical. It's about who should be in charge of education. And, for instance, a strange coalition of left-wingers and conservatives opposed the No Child Left Behind Act in the 2000s, which was an attempt through the federal government to raise standards in schools through testing. Either because the left doesn't like teachers being told what to do, or the right doesn't believe the federal government should be involved in trying to tell people what to do. So I think the objection to that is more to do with philosophy than necessarily what it does. But I take your point. And I also agree that I think Elon is going to discover that the levers in a government are very different to the levers in business. Ultimately, as you and I both know, in this business, what the editor wants does eventually happen. You know, it might take some shouting. Not that ours would do that. He's such a kind and charming man, but but ultimately he can get done what he wants. Even a president can't do that in a government system, which is why Trump frequently found himself putting out orders that weren't followed through. There's a famous occasion when John Bolton attended a meeting to discuss border policy during the Trump administration, and he was horrified to discover that officials were discussing bringing in the United Nations to police the border. This was absolutely not Donald Trump's policy, but as bureaucrats often do, they have an institutional idea of what should be done, and they just go away and do it in their own silo, and it's very difficult to correct them. So he's going to try to bring the same structure of corporate governments to federal government. Good luck with that. We're talking, Trump doesn't just have to fill the cabinet, by the way. He has to fill thousands of government positions. And through much of his administration, for many years administration, those positions went unfilled because people, if nothing else, were unwilling to work for him.
Just going back to that Department of Education, could we just get rid of it? As I say, a Republican idea which has been there for many decades. There's just the process of doing something like that. Javier Milei may have just been able to rip things off an org chart and look like he was acting, but to make that change in America would need a super majority in the Senate. So although the Republicans are the majority in the Senate and in the House, it still is a high bar. And in 2023, when they last voted on the issue of the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education, 60 Republicans voted with Democrats. It's a method for non-Trump Republicans to show they're not going to be led by the nose by Trump, because Trump does obviously lead the Republican Party, but not the whole of the Republican Party wants to be led by him.
Yes.
So even though the Senate is Republican, the House is Republican, it doesn't mean he necessarily has all the Republicans he needs to get some of these big things through. So,
but he does now have a Conservative majority on the Supreme Court on his side. Which is
going to be helpful. Yeah, it's going to be helpful. Let's just go through a few of the other people that he has hired. Trump has hired alongside Musk and Ramaswamy. Pete Hegseth is going to be the new Secretary of Defense. He's a combat veteran who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's actually at the moment a co-host on Fox and Friends Weekend, of course, Donald Trump's favorite TV channel. Other cabinet members so far also include Susie Wiles, who managed the Trump election campaign as the chief of staff, Tom Homan as the border czar, and Elise Stefanik as UN ambassador, so the US ambassador to the United Nations. Also, Trump looks likely to pick Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. Kristi Noem is widely expected to be announced as the Homeland Security Secretary. She caused controversy when she wrote a book detailing how she had shot her 14-month-old dog Cricket because he was untrainable, which sounds quite tough. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., of the Kennedy clan, something of a conspiracy theorist around COVID and vaccines, has previously been mentioned by Trump as a contender to lead on health policy, but nothing has been announced as yet.
As with all these appointments, the media always jumps on something hilarious about them, and there usually is one detail that is very funny. But in the case, for instance, of Kristi Noem, she's primarily famous actually for not imposing a lockdown order during COVID, right? In the case of Tom Homan, he worked under Obama. He is famous for separating families and children at the border. He is well known as a deporter. You may or may not like that policy, but the point is he's on the same side as Trump. The interesting one for me is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Will he get something? And there you see a real tension within the Trump administration, inevitably, that he is a proper opponent of big business. Now, you might say for wacko reasons, if that's your view, if you think he's a conspiracy theorist on vaccines, but that's what he is. He is a critic of big pharma. Is a Republican conservative administration going to give a very powerful role to a critic of big pharma? I'd be very surprised if it did.